Hello, I'm with Scott Zafir today, exercise physiologist and workplace rehab provider. First question, what is exercise physiology? And what does an exercise physiologist do for somebody?
Yeah, well, lovely to be talking to you, Michael. Yeah, so like Michael mentioned, I've worked in the exercise physiology field for a while. Yeah, what is an exercise physiologist is a really common question because we're a newer industry. There's a few different ways to explain it. A lot of exercise physiologists don't like this answer, but it's similar to a physiotherapist in the sense that we have 4-year degrees, we're allied health, we understand different medical conditions, different medications and the impacts that have on people. But we approach rehabilitation closer to, say, a personal trainer, someone that's prescribing exercises, understanding your goals and helping you achieve those health-related goals. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is we're generally focused on more long-term conditions and systemic chronic diseases rather than acute musculoskeletal injuries that physios generally spend time doing. But what generally seems to happen in the healthcare industry and what makes it hard being on someone who's trying to access healthcare is over time, the practitioner's scope of confidence and competence starts to merge. So you might get clear boundaries on what they can do as graduates, but over time you could have an exercise physiologist that's focusing purely on musculoskeletal early intervention and a physiotherapist that is focusing on cardiovascular health, diabetes, and chronic diseases. So it does start to merge over time.
So as you become more higher up in your profession, you specialize, and those specializations can sort of have a lot of overlap. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Essentially, yeah.
Comparing exercise physiology to physiotherapy, which people are more familiar with. So tell me about the workplace rehab provider component of who you are. What does that entail?
Yeah, so I started off in the clinical setting, exercise physiology, and then I moved into workplace rehab. The difference there is over time, it doesn't really matter what your allied healthcare background is. It's its own particular industry. But there's definitely transferable skills that come across to that industry as well. So as workplace rehab providers, we're generally helping in the injury coordination and planning for someone to return to work after an injury and maintain work and maintain safety in that process.
So what does that journey look like in your scope? Somebody has an injury, they can't work whatever job they were doing, and how do they go about navigating that space, and what do they do? Do they get back to their old job, or do they find new employment? What's the, I suppose either thing could happen. What's the typical journey?
Yeah, so it might help just to run through a full lifespan of someone's recovery, and that gives you a nice sort of foundation. So say there's a workplace injury, someone goes to work, they pick up a box, they feel some pain in their back, they go to their manager and say, hey, look, my back's hurting, I'm gonna go see a doctor and head home for the day. That manager then does an incident report and has to report that injury to the workers' compensation for that state. So I'm based in Queensland, they'll most likely be work over Queensland. That worker then goes sees their doctor, the doctor does a medical certificate, depending on the severity, might say they can't work or they can work in some limited capacity. When that occurs, you now have a few stakeholders involved. You've got your employer, you've got the person that suffered an injury, you've got the insurer involved, and the doctor as well. So if it's a mild back strain, they can do most of their job, they're a sedentary worker. After a couple of weeks, they're back to normal, back to the pre-injury status. then that all closes down. However, sometimes it's a lot more complex. The injury they suffer might be quite severe. Maybe there's some tension between the employer and the worker. They don't feel they're being supported. Maybe there's even some tension with the worker and insurer, where they don't feel like they're getting enough payment, or maybe it's even tension between the worker and the doctor, where they don't feel the doctor's doing the right thing by them. So once complexity comes involved and things don't seem to be going according to plan, that's when sometimes the insurer refers to a workplace rehab provider to help address those barriers for return to work, liaise with all the stakeholders, do workplace assessments, develop a plan, and support them back on their return to work journey. So that could be back to the same job, back to a modified, permanently modified version of that job. And in some cases, that could be a new employer. Maybe they've been terminated from their job, maybe going back to that job's unsafe or not suitable anymore for either physical or psychological reason. And in that case, we help them through the journey of what we call new employer services, vocational services. So resumes, cover letters, finding jobs, and supporting them getting new employment.
I'm imagining that back injuries and back pain and that sort of stuff is quite common. Probably one of the more common things. Is that the case, or is there something else that's injury-wise that's more common that maybe people wouldn't imagine?
Yeah, definitely back pain. Back injuries or back pain is one of the leading causes. Musculoskeletal in general is one of the biggest issues. So outside of back pain, you're dealing with shoulder injuries, upper limb injuries, repetitive strain injuries. So they're most certainly the most common ones, but that varies industry to industry.
Yeah, of course.
But if we're looking at a broad picture, definitely back pain. And psychological injuries are now picking up a lot as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you talked about tension, and I imagine quite often there's a lot of complexity to people's employment situations and the background context that they bring with the injury. So what's the go with this psychological injury? What is that?
Yeah, so it's what we'd call a primary psychological injury, where that's a primary cause of the workers' compensation or compensable injury. And we'll use the term injury for psychological injury or a physical injury, which I like the term psychological injury in the sense that it draws that clear parallel, and then you're not having a double standard for physical and psychological.
I was going to say, I've never seen it used that way, but I love it. I love that, the use of that word.
Yeah, and it gives you the same ability to interact with that injury. You can talk about recovery timeframes, treatments. So it makes the rehab process a lot more intangible in many ways. So common psychological injuries, workplace harassment and bullying. They could be armed holdups, common as well. Unfortunately, people in hospitality getting abused from customers. It could be prolonged stresses. So there are a lot of different things that cause those psychological injuries. What's also very common is what we call a secondary psychological injury, where someone's hurt their back or have a physical injury. And then from there, their mental health has declined as well. So they might have not started with depression or anxiety, but throughout the process of their recovery, they've developed depression, anxiety, or some sort of adjustment to injury disorder.
Absolutely. I imagine that not being able to do your job has a massive impact on your psychological health. So what's the journey like for somebody who has to make a modification to the way that they do their job? I imagine that's quite challenging psychologically, given that work is so important to how we identify ourselves and get satisfaction from our lives and who we are. And I imagine that can be potentially quite a challenge with employers and that sort of stuff. What's the journey like for somebody that has to modify how they do their job?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult. If So you're thrusted into large scale change quickly. Suddenly you've gone from living your life in a particular way where you've developed structures and routines and ways to potentially manage your well-being, to now that's all being thrown up in the air, and you've got to work out how to reestablish clear routines in your life. So like you mentioned, work provides you purpose, direction, even provides the obvious. It gives you financial stability as well,
of course,
which is huge.
and I can imagine that somebody in that situation might get harassment in the workplace, bullying in the workplace, where they might not have had that issue before. They've come back to work and they're doing something different, and they are getting a bit of blowback from their co-workers and that sort of thing. Is that something that you see often that compounds the issue?
Yeah, it's very common, because managers and HR and the worker, they don't want to disclose all the personal things that are going on in their life to their colleagues. But if there's a fixed amount of work that needs to be done in that workplace, and the employer is unable to or hasn't developed other strategies to pick up that workload, now suddenly someone that's only doing 50% of the workload, that workload has to go elsewhere in the business. Thankfully, some businesses are large and have very good processes in place to not impact the other employees. But there are a lot of smaller businesses where any sort of new process that's added or any new employee added to that business really impacts their bottom line. So now they're really in a difficult position, and that brings up stresses not only for the colleagues, but also for the manager or the business owner that has to deal with that added financial stress. So tensions are high across the board.
So what can an employer do? Not necessarily like just generally speaking, whether they have an injured employee or not, like to anticipate and be flexible in these kinds of challenges. What might be something that you're not seeing from employers that they could do, or what's something that could be changed across the board for employers to mitigate some of these challenges?
The biggest thing is maintaining a strong, positive relationship with the person that suffered an injury.
Okay.
That by far is the biggest thing. Because once that relationship's severed or damaged, it's very hard to repair. And now suddenly that person's recovery and injury is going to be extended in most situations. So adding further pressure onto the person that has an injury, not keeping in contact with them, disengaging, not inviting them to team events, not being inclusive, that person's going to feel isolated. They're going to be less motivated to return to work. That sort of moves them down that pathway of a potential secondary psychological injury. And as we know, the most common symptom really with musculoskeletal stuff is going to be pain. And pain is not as simple as there's damage done to your muscles or bones and therefore you're experiencing pain. Pain's the interpretation of that negative nociceptive stimulus through your brain, and that interpretation of that stimulus is going to be impacted by the way you're looking at it. So if you're highly stressed, you're not sleeping well, you're not feeling supported, suddenly that intensity of pain can increase. So by far the best thing is keep that relationship strong. And then depending on the size of organization, you'd have different strategies that you could look at. So if you're a smaller business, leveraging services that don't cost you money that provide you support would be an easy thing. So talking to the insurer about different incentives, talking to a workplace rehab provider to get support that's funded by the insurer. But if you're a larger business, you'd likely have an internal department that you might want to, get some consulting services involved to make sure that you have the optimal processes in place.
So there's a lot in what you've talked about one thing I'm imagining is somebody who's got an injury, has time off work to recover. Maybe they have like a hospital stay if it was bad, you know, to reconstruct some sort of injury or ligament tear type thing. And how does an employer navigate? And I'm particularly imagining smaller businesses based on what you're talking about. Like, so an employee's maybe gone to hospital for a bit, taking time off work. How do you navigate that, maintaining that connection thing with them? Because normally they'd be in work 5 days a week, and now they've, you know, in pain. They're busy with rehabilitation stuff, hospital stuff, or whatever the case may be. What can employers do to keep the communication lines open, but not be disrupting that sort of healing process?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, because there might be specific circumstances or types of injuries that might warrant a slightly different approach. But generally speaking, you want to lean on the side of over communicating.
Okay.
And quite often from the employer side, you might feel that that if you're contacting them outside of work hours or while they're off work, you're disruptive. But it's not like you're calling them up to say, hey, look, can you come in and do a shift tomorrow? Hey, we've got some work coming. When are you coming back? What's going on? You know, do you have a new certificate? You might ask those questions in part of a long conversation, but really you want to be framing that discussion by being empathetic.
Yeah.
Understanding, how are you going at the moment? Is there anything that we can provide? You know, you follow the rehabilitation and direction from your treating team. Your job's waiting for here when you're ready. Whatever we can do to support you. You know, once you have an appropriate amount of capacity, you know, we're more than happy for you to recover at work. So rather than recovering, coming back to work, it's essentially recovering at work is the ideal standard. So as your capacity builds, so does your work. So you don't go from doing nothing to everything at once. So if you're coming from an empathetic standpoint and you're using your judgment, you're not calling them every day and they've just come out of surgery. Most people, and if you know your employee as well, will be able to push back a little bit and say, hey, look, I prefer you call me every fortnight. But 99, to be honest, I haven't heard a complaint yet from any worker where they've felt that their employer has communicated with them too much.
Okay.
It doesn't happen unless it's a communication that's not directed at the worker's well-being and directed at the business's objectives. Then that gets perceived as a stressor, and then that becomes an issue.
And what about an employee who has an injury and they can't go back to doing the kind of work that they can do with a modification? They have to find new work. What's that journey like?
Yeah, so we'll have what we call a hierarchy of return to work goals. So it would work down the hierarchy. So the gold standard is return to work with your same employer doing your pre-injury duties. If that's not achieved, then it's return to work to your same employer in a new role. So if they say they can't come back to work in a particular role where there's a lot of manual handling, could they do a supervisory role? Could they do an office-based role in that same company that might be more suitable for their capacity? If that's not achieved, then is it a new employer doing their pre-injury duties or a new employer doing a new role? So we'd slowly sort of work our way down. If it was a very significant injury and had to be a whole new job with a new employer, then would provide extra support in identifying what those suitable roles would look like, and then helping them work towards securing one of those suitable roles.
And I imagine there's a lot of a big psychological component to identifying a new thing that you could do after being in one particular area for however long in your working life. So there's probably a lot of psychosocial stuff going on in terms of getting them to navigate that space and get to where they need to go.
Definitely. So the way a rehab provider business generally set up is we've got, typically speaking, a new employer team and a same employer team. And your same employer team is generally going to be built with physiotherapists, occupational therapists, exercise physiologists, more your physical orientated allied healthcare team. And then you got your new employer team with your rehab counselors, your social workers, your psychologists. And they would do what's called a vocational assessment, where when they're identifying their suitable options, they have to meet a certain level of criteria. So the word suitable is loaded in the industry, and that will mean suitable in sense of your interests, your transferable skills, the labor market in that area you live, as well as suitable financially. If you're on a certain level of salary, then we need to find a role that's equivalent in some regards.
Okay. I want to bring the conversation around to my area of interest, which is the disability sector and the disability community. And I love talking to different people about what disability is and what it means to them and all that sort of stuff, because it's a social construct and it means different things based on people's life experiences. This topic is complex and more complex than I would have imagined, and has so many different components to it. And it's we are talking about disability in some sense, depending on how you interpret disability as a concept. When we're talking about people modifying the way that they live because of an injury, when we're talking about people having to find new kinds of work because of an injury, but also like, and this is, you know, open to interpretation, but I would think that if we're talking about maybe PTSD or some sort of psychological trauma that someone's experienced in the workplace that's changing how they operate in the world, then we're also talking about disability in a broad sense. And by and large, the disability community has lots of challenges with many industries and many workplaces and getting employment, getting flexible working arrangements, getting opportunities to be seen as a valuable member of society even, and just to get opportunities to get themselves you know, fully participating in the workplace, whether it's a physical thing or a psychological thing. And I imagine there's a lot of overlap between some of the narratives coming out of your industry, the people that have experienced injuries and face challenges, and people in the disability sector. And I think certainly when I think about disability, I think about primarily congenital issues, people that have had lifelong challenges, but something like 80% of those with a disability weren't born with the disability. That doesn't mean they all had a workplace accident, but they've come across something later in their life. So this really does represent a big component of the disability community, those that have something happen to them or have a diagnosis later in life that impacts the way that they live. So I don't think, even though, I would say that I come from that background, that community of the disabled people with a congenital issue. Most people, I think of those people as well. Most people, I don't think, are thinking of the majority that have an injury or whatever during their lifetime, and then have to change their way of being. I think most people don't think of that when they think of disability. So I want to first ask whether the disability sector, whether disability culture, ideas and stuff coming from the disability community, is that coming into the people that you're serving? Are they bringing that with them? Are they getting impacted by it, or do they see themselves in that way, or are they going through a journey of seeing themselves in that way, or do they see themselves as injured people? Like, obviously somebody who's got some back pain that can do something to get back to the way they were, I imagine, might not necessarily think of themselves in that way, but somebody who's making a significant change into the way that they work may or may not see themselves in that way, depending on their interactions with the disability community, depending on their environment and how they see themselves. I'm wondering if maybe through the way they use language, or the way they talk about the workplace, is there some sort of influence that the disability community has in this space, or
Yeah.
is there room for that to happen? Maybe.
Yeah, there's if you see me glancing down, I made a lot of notes. I think there's a lot of points there. I think it depends on where they are in their recovery. So, and the severity of their injury. So if it's, lack of a better term, a mild injury they've suffered, a lot of the times in the industry, we're looking to normalize and not pathologize and help them re-engage as quick as possible. So it's quite often, like there's a continuum with everything. So it's just important to understand that, just to frame that if someone feels as if this is unfair in their particular scenario. But say there was an incident that occurred at work. Well, let's say it was an arm holdup. And from there, you're now anxious while you're in that environment. In some regards, that's normal, right? Like it'd be atypical to go home that day and feel completely calm, and then feel completely calm going back to work. Now, that doesn't mean that because you feel completely calm, there's something wrong with you. But it also doesn't mean that if you feel anxious in that scenario, that there is something wrong with you as well. So quite often in those early stages, and I'm not a psychologist, so just to frame that in there as well. So I'm sure there's other people that can speak more fluently around these areas. But you certainly don't want to be coming and adding a label to something straight off the bat. And quite often labels can be scary. If you see a long word like epicondylitis and your understanding or your health literacy is still developing, then that's going to be quite confrontational. And concerning for that person. So that's in the earlier stages where you don't necessarily want to do that. Sometimes it's obvious, right? If there's a head trauma, multiple amputations, something big, then obviously you're not going to try and start trying to normalize things off the bat. A lot of that's adjustment then. And that adjustment process, from my experience working with people and the people I've worked with, is long. It takes a long time. You've got to get through the initial recover from the trauma. You've got to try and engage with life again as normal as possible. And then it seems to come when they start socializing again.
Okay.
And then when they start socializing and meeting people, the group of people that previously they may have not engaged with, now suddenly, you know, they have this bond. You know, I've had an amputation, you've had an amputation, and they talk about that, and that's sort of their in to the disability community.
Yeah.
And now, and that's really healing in many ways, because they get to share stories, connect with people, and I think really importantly, feel understood.
Yeah.
It's not consoling to have someone that hasn't gone through it say to them, I understand, or, you know, that's normal, when they know you haven't gone through what they've gone through. So having someone that has gone through it say, you know, this is how I feel, and they go, great, you're the same, you've had the same experiences as me, or similar experiences to me. Now they can forge some really strong friendships, and they can start socializing again, which is, if you're looking at a biopsychosocial model for well-being, that address their biological recovery earlier on, the psychological follows, and then the social sort of kicks in then as well. And they start getting a more rounded picture of well-being, and you can start slotting in purpose and financial things at a later date.
I like that there's an emerging theme coming from all this about being communication and community and connecting with people. That seems to come up a lot in this. And I think there's so many different sub-communities in the disability world based on people's experiences, and there's so many different interpretations of disability and everything around it. There's diagnosis-based communities that are heavily influenced by medical model stuff because it might benefit them, or it might really ring true to their experience. And then there's a lot of stuff that sits outside of the medical model as well, and they challenge the idea of diagnoses and that sort of thing. So I can imagine in this space of workplace recovery, there's a lot of room for different experiences connecting with communities based on what we're sort of talking about. Like amputees are going to connect with other amputees and have a really different sense of communal engagement than somebody who's had a purely sort of psychological experience, who's then engaging with other people with that experience as well, because they're engaging over very different things, and they're engaging in different communities that are going to bring different ideas to them. And there's no one way or valid thing. That they're all doing different things. They're all valid in their own way and in their own interpretation of what's happening. So I think there's a lot of complexity to this, and to that whole thing of going into a community to get that acceptance, because that's so important. There's something that can't be got from any other way than going to members of your community and experiencing the connections that can be made from that lived experience that those people have. There's fogging up real bad here in my glasses. But yeah, that's so important. And it's interesting the way that you framed recovery in the layers of and talked about the biopsycho social model. and how people go through, this, I guess, physical and immediate sort of mostly medical recovery, and then there's these sort of like more abstract things that they do after the core medical issue is dealt with. That's sort of how I've picked up on what you were saying.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't know how to navigate a major workplace injury, not having had one, but I'm wondering if it's because our world is so focused on the medical model, and so having that medical model built into not just the healthcare system, but every facet of society, the way that we generally think of disability and treat disabled people, that whole idea of that coming first, and then coming to terms with your injury or whatever, then leads to this space in a community. And I find that interesting. Like, I can imagine that you have to work through a lot of stuff and probably don't want to hear all this terminology that you haven't come across before really early on. But I can also imagine in a different world that like there could be a space for community engagement and connection really early on. Like that could be like almost the first thing. But I can also see it both ways. Like I can see that would be really impactful from the beginning, but then also that it would be overwhelming and all that sort of thing, and you've got to sort of navigate and figure out on your own, like a little bit, how you're going to see yourself. So you've got to come to your own decisions a little bit. But I just can't sort of, there's a tension in me, like this idea that we've got to do the medical stuff first and can't benefit from the community. It's this otherizing of the disability narrative and perspective. But at the same time, I can totally imagine not being ready for new ideas and that sort of thing. And I think maybe part of it is because we usually think of disability as so otherwise, and we don't have like much exposure to it. There's so many people with a disability. There's nearly 1 in 5 people have a disability, but at the same time, there's so many different kinds and sub-communities, so they don't all have the same perspective, and we just don't hear in the media or whatever their points of view of perspective. So a lot of this stuff, I think, can be alien to us and to people joining that community when they do it. And I don't know what to do about that or where to go, but I couldn't help but pick up on that sort of layering. And
yes. So sorry, go on.
No, you say what you're gonna say.
Yeah. So that continuum is what I've observed, not necessarily best practice, right? So ideally, like you said, we get those psychosocial issues, engaging with the community, accessing the benefits of health, of exercise, eating well, sleeping well, all of those great things that bolster someone's well-being. The earlier we can do that, the better. The trouble is, like you mentioned, it's more the adjustment in their mind, and that's where it sort of slowly sort of comes out, because the immediate focus is, how do I cure what's happened to me?
Yeah.
Then there's a certain point where you exhaust the medical system. You see your GP, they try their interventions, they refer to a specialist, they try their interventions. the intervention slowly escalate. And then there's a certain point where either you've exhausted all standard medical options, or the next option has significant risk and might not be worth pursuing based on your level of symptoms. So at that point, you go, okay, I've sort of essentially got the most I can out of the medical system, but I've still got residual issues. And those residual issues could be persistent pain or a whole host of things. And then at that point, you've got to decide, do I continue cycling through this medical model, hoping that there is a particular specialist or doctor out there or somebody that does have the magic pill? Or do I learn how to re-engage with my life? How do I start joining sports again, meeting people, engaging with work, and getting the most out of life, and not making these residual issues the primary focus of my life, and making that, and it's okay to make it the primary focus in a positive way, but not in a limiting way. Not saying because of these residual issues, therefore I can't this, I can't that. And you mentioned as well the diagnoses. So, and I think this is an important part from my experience working in the health field, is the art of healthcare. I think sometimes looking into the healthcare field, it feels like it's all pure science.
Yeah.
Right. This is an issue. This is the outcome. But what we know is, working in it, is you've got the science, you've got the individual, and then you've got the practitioner's experience, philosophies, biases, and in the middle is sort of where healthcare happens. And the point on diagnoses that you made, where some people find it useful, some people don't, I completely agree. I think there's certain diagnoses that aren't necessarily helpful. And there's other ones where not having a diagnosis is causing anxiety, stress, worry, and that ability to finally put a label on what you're experiencing allows you to go, oh, okay, great, I know what it is now, let me move on with my life. So an example is like low back pain. Having imaging straight off the bat and working out what's going on with your back, they generally find the prognosis is worse. So, and the reason is, what the imaging shows may not be what's causing the pain. So if you image a whole bunch of people in the population, some will show up with degenerative changes, some won't. And then if you ask the population who has pain, some will say they have pain, some will don't. But those don't correlate. So the ones with degeneration and problems don't necessarily have the pain. They may have the pain. So what happens is, the moment you have pain and then you image it, now suddenly in your mind or in the diagnosis, that pain is caused by this issue. And if that's a degenerative, long-lasting change, now you feel like, well, the pain is going to stick with me forever. And that's also not to say that it very well could be the reason for the pain. I'm not saying that's not the cause, but no one knows. That's the art of healthcare.
Yeah.
So in that case, I would argue, engage with, exercise, sleeping well, eating well, gradual return back to normal life. See your doctor, make sure definitely there's no red flags or major medical issues that need to be addressed as a priority. But then there's definitely other situations where I met a lovely gentleman who had tremors. And you think that's a fairly obvious thing to get checked out, but at that time he had a workplace injury, so they thought it was all related and they didn't explore it. He was falling over regularly. Once he was provided the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, which is a very, confronting diagnosis to have, it provided him that relief. He's like, oh, now I know why I'm falling over. Now I know why I'm tremoring. Now I know why all these things that have been happening in my life have been occurring. And I think that's where it's very useful to know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you put it, the art of healthcare, because there's certainly a lot more to healthcare than the purely hard sciences component of it. There's so much sociological stuff going on. as well.
Yeah, and I think a really big thing there as well, sorry to get you off, is the schemes that people work under.
Mm,
And I think that's probably a lot of pain that, maybe pain's not the right word, but a lot of annoyance and stress that's added to people's lives is having to navigate the complexity of different schemes.
yeah. So
If they've had an
what
injury, now they've gone on workers' comp, and then they've
yeah,
gone on to life insurance, and they've gone on to the NDIS, and they've gone on to Medicare, and those schemes aren't talking to each other. They all have
yes,
their own paperwork,
yes.
um, and that brings its own stress as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting diagnoses is often a key component of jumping through the hoops of those different systems, because it means that you have the requisite amount of evidence to suggest that you need whatever that system is offering. A big thing in the disability community when it comes to accessing employment is looking at the flexibility, the accessibility in general, but that's flexible working arrangements, optimizing physical spaces for the bodily difference and stuff like that, and working from home, um, that sort of stuff. And there's a bit of a push, a fight from the disability sector, trying to get more of this stuff happening. And there's quite often a bit of universal design that comes in with a lot of ideas when it comes to accessibility. And this takes us away from, we've talked a bit about medical model stuff, and this sort of gets us into social model world, um, social model world of disability. And I think classically we use examples of ramps, like ramps can be used by parents pushing prams or trolleys, or workmen pushing trolleys, or people with using crutches for temporary injuries, not just people with disabilities. And it's kind of the same with workplaces, like, and I want to add on a tangent to this, that a lot of the changes that the disability community has been seeking has happened during COVID, because of the impact that COVID had on the general population, um, working from home and all that sort of stuff. But there's a universal design in flexible working arrangements. It works for parents. It works for all kinds of reasons, people's different lifestyles, and obviously working from home, it works for the environment. It works for lots of different reasons as well. And that speaks to the social model, because it's about disability being a social construction. So how we're impacted by our disability in the life that we live. Like, no one's disabled because we can't fly as humans, because we don't need to. No one's disabled as a human because they can't see, infrared light spectrum stuff, because that's not how we um, have built the world. But we have built the world in certain ways. That means that when we look at accessibility, it means a certain thing. It means ramps and that sort of thing, for example. And it could have always been that we had ramps, but we've not built the world with accessibility in mind. So I feel like, with the ongoing push for accessible workplaces in the disability community. We want disabled people to have full access to all of the facets of human life, full participation in workplaces and all that sort of stuff. And we're talking about, I mean, we're hopefully not talking about exploiting more and more people under capitalist systems. We're talking about like getting disabled people out of poverty. That's why we want them to be in the workplace. We want them to engage with society and get the fulfillment that comes with having a job, because it's a big positive psychological thing. Hopefully your job is a good psychological thing and not a bad one. And I feel like there's a lot of overlap with the stuff that people are talking about when they're talking about making workplaces better for that purpose. There's, when we're talking about getting people back to the workplace because they've had an injury or whatever, we're talking about similar stuff when we say there's got to be modifications, but we're always talking about it on an individual level. And I suppose there is a degree to which everyone is an individual and they have individual needs, but it's interesting the way the system's set up is that that person with an injury is the one that has to jump through the hoops to get these individual modifications just so that they can get back to work, so that they can, you know, stay in the workplace and then not be vulnerable to poverty and all this sort of thing that comes with not having access to suitable working arrangements. So is there, I want to see more accessible workplaces, and that means a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts within disability. But is there things that we can change systemically to mitigate some of this stuff, and it maybe not being such a giant thing that people have to deal with? On top of the injury, we have to deal with the sociological impacts of jumping through all the hoops to get to where they're going now that they've had this big thing happen to them. Is there systemic things that we can do or campaign for or work towards to see a more equitable workplaces?
Yeah, certainly. So lots of great sort of points jumping out. And probably the other interesting thing that stood out to me looking at the health benefits of work, and there's a consensus statement that Australia and New Zealand have that outlined the health benefits of good work. And I think the important bit there is good work as well. Is also the transgenerational impact. Because if you have children, they're modeling off you. So if you're working, and that's setting setting that a good example as well. But I can appreciate there are those difficulties in gaining employment, maintaining employment, and finding a workplace that is supportive and accessible. On the employability side, one comment, and it's going to be difficult for different people depending on their individual circumstances, but supporting people transitioning to new work, the one thing I can confidently say is job seeking is a skill. So the person that gets the job is not the person that's best for the job. The person that gets the job is a person that sells themselves as the best person for the job. And that's a skill. So that's a point of encouragement to know that you can improve in your way that you're approaching job seeking to find work.
Okay.
The other encouraging side is talking and working within global companies. The discussion is really towards inclusion. Is a very big point moving forward. And in that space, making sure that there's benefits set up for employees to ensure that they're unique circumstances are being addressed and supported. And working from home not only has become more in the forefront because of the obvious pandemic, but also the way offices set up. So offices I've worked in, they can't support 100% capacity if every employee came in.
Mm.
So they're actually hiring out or leasing out office spaces that can't meet the capacity, knowing that there'll be a portion of the workforce that works from home.
Yeah.
And I think disability sector or the business case for inclusion is very clear. Having teams that are diverse are all going to be able to look at complex business problems through different lenses and come up with unique solutions. You don't want a team full of the same personality, the same gender, the same thoughts, the same abilities, because you do need different perspectives, particularly if you're going head to head with the same problem over and over again. So just some points of encouragement from what I'm saying is, it does feel like it's going in the right direction, but the problem with all of this stuff is it's always so slow.
Yeah.
It's in the right direction, but when will it get to a point that it's not having drastic impacts on people's lives today?
Yeah.
And that's a part where, yeah, I don't have the answer, but I think looping back to the strong business case, quite often one of the key reasons managers want workers in the workforce is to build up a team culture and for retention.
Yeah.
If a manager wants someone in the workplace to monitor their productivity, look, for certain industries that might be required, but that seems fairly antiquated in most workplaces and most work nowadays.
Yeah.
So it's more to build up that team connection, but it can have the inverse effect. If you have someone with young children or a disability, or the selling point of your job is the ability to work from home, it'd make no sense to mandate them coming into work, because that's going to impact retention. So if you have an ability to hire a workforce that's eager to work, that has unique perspectives, that's willing to work from home, that's probably going to have, I'm not sure, but if you provide them the support and care they need, arguably they'll build up stronger loyalty and retention. It seems quite clear that should be the focus moving forward for employers. So it might be a matter of education, but I'm sure I'm not very politically savvy, I'm sure there's political movements out there as well that could sort of pull on that financial lever as well.
Yeah. And it's it's such a strong point and strong case that you've put forward, the value of different ways of thinking and being, and the importance of that in the workplace. But I can't help but ask, how do you sell yourself in a job interview? What's the you said that those are the people who get the jobs, the ones that can sell themselves. So what are the key things that we can do to get jobs in? How do we sell ourselves?
Well, that's a question that can go on for hours, but some quick tips. So these are the questions that I would prepare answers for. Tell me about yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And examples.
Yeah.
They're the things I'll prepare for. Everything else you can generally answer. They're probably more logistics-based questions or behavioral questions. Tell me about yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? They might not ask those particular questions, but there'll be similar questions, right? It will be, what are you up to today? Or what brings you here today? Why did you apply for the job? That you tell me about yourself. Essentially an open-ended question that says, sell me and I want to know if I like you.
Yeah.
And most feedback from most employers when we're trying to place them into work is, are they going to get on with the team? Are they going to cause issues? Essentially, do I like them? And from there is, do they want to work? Are they motivated? Very rarely is it skill. Now, I'm sure there's very technical jobs that skill is the key factor. Or there are jobs where, say, you're a truck driver and your ability to interact with people doesn't really matter as much because you're spending such a long time by yourself. But for a lot of work and a lot of industries, your ability to get on with people is critical, and most employers know they can train up someone to do the job. They just want to know whether that investment in that particular individual is going to pay off for them, because that's a big investment financially. So tell me about yourself. What are your strengths? It could be something similar to, why should we hire you, or why do you think you'll excel in the job, or something like that. They're the ones that if you don't have an answer prepared for, you'll generally come up with something trivial. And you'll come up with something, I'm good, I'm nice, I'm loyal, I'm great, I'm reliable. And they're not very impactful questions. So the key one, so like I said, tell me about yourself, strengths, weaknesses, and examples. Those examples should really be stories, I think is a better way to put it. And stories are essentially the way you're going to sell yourself. And you want to have a particular narrative. So an example is someone says, what's your strength? And someone, a young guy says, I'm a hard worker. Give me an example. I've worked 40-hour days for the last 4 years. I've taken no sick leave, and I'm dedicated to my job, and I shop on time, and I always do an extra 10 minutes at the end of the clock off. All right, great. Another person comes in. Well, what's your strength? They say, I'm hardworking. Give me an example. I'm a single mom. I have 3 children. I'm doing a course in the background. I've worked 2 jobs. I'm doing this. Suddenly you think that's memorable, right? Or, I still remember an example someone gave to me. They said, what are your strengths? I said, I'm good working under pressure. I go, well, give me an example. And they said, I was in this factory, and there's this massive tank that had 400 liters of fluid, and then one of the pipes burst, and it was spraying out fluid. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. I was the only person on. I couldn't call my manager, right? That's a story that you're linked in. Like right now you feel, well, what happened? How did you solve that? And that's going to be something that's memorable. And you want that theme to show throughout your conversation with them. So they leave, they go, who was that person that, that really hard-working person that did all that thing? Who was that guy that really managed that under pressure? And that's where stories and engaging with the person is essentially the sell of yourself, because you're showing you can communicate, you're showing really clear examples that make sense to them, that they can grip onto and take with them. So I hope that helps.
That's great advice, I think. I want to wrap up, go on a bit of a tangent. Just because we've been talking about impacts of the workplace and we've mentioned COVID, has COVID made an impact on your work in terms of the kinds of clients that you're seeing, the people that are impacted by injuries and stuff? Is there stuff happening because of COVID? The way workplaces are changing? Is it impacting the way that people are affected by workplace injuries?
Yeah, there's a lot of operational changes, certainly. A lot of different type of work coming in as well. So from a business standpoint, the workflow is going to ebb and flow based on whether there's a lockdown or not. It's also going to change the way we deliver services. So we're doing a lot more virtual delivery of services as well. It changes the way quite often employers said they weren't able to provide suitable duties at home for workers due to security risk. But now that's a more widespread option to people that don't have that ability to access the workplace. I think it's certainly harder to place people into what we call host placement or voluntary style work, because certain industries have suffered a fair bit. So if you're a business that you've had to let people go and you can't really keep on the doors, coming in to sell yourself as an intern or a volunteer or a host placement is a lot harder thing to do to those businesses. So that's one of the challenges that we've noticed.
Are we seeing any positive stuff happening with more movement to work from home? Is there more accessibility for people to do that work from home, or are we just seeing a lot of bad stuff with the economic situation and that sort of thing?
I think, like I mentioned before, I think it's a clear silver lining that employers have had to change their internal policies and manage their cybersecurity risk and essentially change their business operations to make it feasible for someone to work from home. And now that they've set up that precedent, that can then translate to potentially opening up new opportunities for people that have access issues to certain workplaces. So I think that's yeah, a great silver lining that's come out of the situation. I think it's also important that people that are working from home on a preventative side, that's paired with work health and safety, ergonomics, and support for that transition. So you don't have people that are now moving into an environment that might not be set up appropriately that lead to injuries and problems.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot more that's going to happen in that space as the COVID situation unfolds and goes on. And it's been fantastic getting to talk to you about all this stuff. I've certainly learnt a lot, and we can certainly speak to the complexity of workplaces and workplace injuries. And I think there's certainly a lot of overlap in terms of the narratives that are coming from your workplace and the culture of the disability community, and lots of positivity as well, just at least a lot of hope for change and flexible cultures in the future where we can adapt and appreciate different ways of living and being, and allowing that in our lives and in our workplaces. So I'd love to continue this chat down the track and get more into the weeds of the issues that people face getting employment after injuries and all that sort of thing. So yeah, great to chat.
Yeah, lovely to speak to you as well. And equally, it's great to learn more about the work you do and the sector you're in as well. So thank you.
Thank you.